Western cities around the world. Now, to most in the United States, reactions to a crisis like this seem grotesque, really unimaginable. But to Mandarin speakers who follow China carefully and have for a long time, these were highly familiar moves. The first reflex of the Chinese government is always to lie in order to hide failure and avoid embarrassment. In 2003, for example, the Chinese government lied about the initial outbreak of SARS, another coronavirus. In July of 2011, two passenger trains traveling in opposite directions smashed into each other at high speed outside the Chinese city of Wenzhou. The trains collided on a railroad bridge. 4 cars derailed and tumbled to the ground below. Within hours, authorities arrived with backhoes. They pushed the passenger cars into a pit and began covering them with dirt. By some accounts, there were still survivors inside at the time, inside the passenger cars. In their initial statements, Chinese officials claimed that a lightning strike had caused that crash. They later conceded under pressure that it was sloppiness and shoddy construction that were to blame. Chinese media, meanwhile, were ordered to ignore the crash entirely except, quote, for positive news, or that news issued by authorities. This was the template for China's official response to the Wuhan virus. From the early days of the outbreak, Chinese diplomats around the world insisted there was no chance whatsoever the virus had come from a lab. They sometimes insisted this even when no one had asked them, as if they were reading from a script. It soon became very obvious what was going on. English-language academic journals had raised for years questions about the safety standards in Wuhan bioresearch labs. An article in Nature, for example, from 2017, noted that, quote, some scientists outside China worry about pathogens escaping from the facility. Classified State Department cables a year later voiced the same concerns. Chinese scientists themselves publicly discussed working with extremely dangerous pathogens in Wuhan. As of today, says someone in a position to know, there is, quote, almost unanimous agreement in the American intelligence gathering agencies that the virus currently destroying much of the world emerged from a lab in Wuhan. Almost unanimous. That's a phrase almost never used to describe any conclusion coming out of the intel community. Government officials in this country have believed that for some time now. They've been unable to interest our media, or our epidemiologists, in writing about it. In recent weeks, analysts from the CIA, the NSA, and others have briefed staff at the New York Times about the origins of this virus, but the newspaper has still not reported their findings. At the same time, and this may be directly related, China has been waging an unremitting propaganda war on the subject. Chinese officials have tried to squelch all conversations about who might be responsible for this pandemic by inflaming the political sensitivities and race guilt of American elites. Watch this clip from early last month as the spokesman for the Chinese Foreign Ministry tries to dictate how American press outlets describe the virus.
Certain media say this coronavirus is a China virus. This is extremely irresponsible, and we firmly oppose that.
Among the many ironies in what you just heard, even now, even today, the disease is widely referred to in China as the Wuhan virus. Our news outlets, meanwhile, almost always call it COVID-19. That term does not translate to Chinese. COVID-19 is the name devised by the World Health Organization back in January under influence from Chinese leaders who were anxious to deflect responsibility for it. Once they succeeded in removing any hint of origin from the name of the virus, the Chinese government launched a campaign to tar anyone who mentioned Wuhan as a dangerous racist. Quote, racism is not the right tool to cover your own incompetence, lectured Chinese state media when President Trump referred to the Wuhan virus. American media parroted that line almost precisely, as no doubt the Chinese expected they would.
The president referred to the coronavirus as a, quote, foreign virus. And I think it's going to come across to a lot of Americans as smacking of xenophobia.
Xenophobic wartime Trump, where he thinks the only path now is to basically declare the virus public enemy number one, paint it in somewhat racist terms.
The xenophobia and the racism in outbreak is such a common thing, and it is incredibly dangerous. It is problematic, and it is scary, and I just really want to call that out.
Why do you keep calling this the Chinese virus? Why do you keep using this? A lot of people say it's racist.
It's not racist at all, no, not at all. It comes from China. That's why.
Fools. But not a major victory for the Chinese government. Media outlets are relatively easy to corrupt given the low level of sophistication of the people who work there. The Chinese government had bolder aims than that. The Chinese instructed their employees and assets in the United States to exert influence on elected officials. For example, according to an informed U.S. government official, quote, Beijing has instructed diplomats in their consulate in San Francisco to work with American state and local officials and members of Congress to push back against anyone who gets too far out on blaming China for this. That's what they're doing. Apparently, it's working. Here's Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy on CNN earlier this week.
The reason that we're in the crisis that we are today is not because of anything that China did, is not because of anything the WHO did. It's because of what this president is.
It's not because anything China did. Other members of Congress voiced similar views, often in eerily similar language. Barbara Lee of California, long considered a strongly pro-China voice, tweeted this to the president, quote, diseases don't have nationalities. China isn't to blame for you fumbling this crisis, end quote. On March 12, Congresswoman Judy Chu of Los Angeles wrote this, quote, China didn't unleash anything. A virus spread as viruses do. Blaming China and insisting on calling this the Wuhan virus, even though every medical expert said not to, is putting people's lives in danger. Stop politicizing this and put people first. Just the week before Chu wrote that, on March 6th, a man called Zhang Ping, who runs the Chinese consulate in Los Angeles, met with Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti about the American response to coronavirus. And he tweeted about it that day. He said this, quote, looking forward to working closely with the city of Los Angeles to address this common public health challenge and develop closer ties between our cities and peoples, end quote. Now, we have no idea what Ping and Garcetti talked about in that meeting that day. It would be interesting to know. We reached out today to a number of California lawmakers with a history of closeness to China. That includes senior Senator Dianne Feinstein, who once employed a Chinese spy, to see if they have spoken to Chinese officials recently. None of them responded to our calls. But it's not just happening in California. According to a study and a story reported by National Review, the head of the state senate in Wisconsin recently received multiple emails from the wife of the Chinese consul general in Chicago. She asked him to propose a resolution praising China for its handling of the Wuhan virus outbreak. The entire story of how the government of China has successfully shaped our understanding of this pandemic, of the virus, as well as our response to it, may take years to tell. And in fact, it may never fully be told at all, though we promise to do our best on this show. But it is clear how China sees this pandemic. China doesn't see this simply or even primarily as a public health disaster in which thousands are dying. China sees this as part of a larger geopolitical struggle for control of the world. Most Americans still don't perceive that or understand the profound gravity of the stakes involved, but how could they? Our leaders have lied to us about it for years. Brian Dean Wright is a Democrat and a former CIA